The morning fog hung low over Buckingham Palace as Thomas Crawford walked through the iron gates for what he believed would be an ordinary Tuesday shift. He had served as a royal guard for nearly 15 years, and, in that time, he had learned that the palace held more secrets within its ancient walls than most people could ever imagine. The stones themselves seemed to whisper stories of kings and queens, of love affairs and betrayals, of promises kept and broken across centuries of British history. Thomas was a man of simple origins. He had grown up in a small village in Yorkshire, the son of a factory worker and a schoolteacher. His mother had always told him that he was destined for something greater, though she never could have imagined that her son would one day walk the same corridors as royalty. When he joined the military at 18, he did so because he wanted to serve his country. When he was selected for the Royal Guard at 32, he felt as though his entire life had been leading to that moment. The palace was different in the early morning hours. Before the tourists gathered at the gates with their cameras and their dreams of catching a glimpse of someone famous, before the staff rushed about preparing for the day's events, there was a quietness that Thomas had come to treasure. He would walk his rounds slowly, taking in the portraits that lined the walls, the furniture that had been touched by generations of monarchs, the windows that looked out onto gardens that had witnessed history unfold. On this particular morning, Thomas was assigned to a section of the palace that he rarely visited. There had been some construction work happening in the East Wing, and several guards had been reassigned to cover different areas while the regular routes were temporarily closed. Thomas found himself walking down a long corridor that he had only passed through a handful of times in his entire career. The corridor was lined with doors, most of them locked and unmarked. Thomas knew that behind these doors lay storage rooms filled with items that the royal family had accumulated over centuries. Some contained furniture that was too valuable to use but too historically significant to sell or donate. Others held clothing, documents, artwork, and countless other treasures that the public would never see. As Thomas walked, he noticed that one of the doors was slightly open. This was unusual because the palace had very strict protocols about security. Every door was supposed to be locked, and every lock was supposed to be checked multiple times throughout the day. Thomas approached the door carefully, his training kicking in automatically. He placed his hand on his radio, ready to call for backup if necessary. He pushed the door open slowly, expecting to find a maintenance worker or perhaps a member of the cleaning staff who had forgotten to secure the room. Instead, he found himself looking into a space that took his breath away. The room was larger than he had expected, stretching back into shadows that the weak morning light could not penetrate. But what caught his attention was not the size of the room. It was what the room contained. Clothing racks lined the walls, dozens of them, each one holding garments that Thomas could tell were extraordinarily valuable even from a distance. He could see gowns and robes, suits and uniforms, hats and accessories of every kind. The fabric shimmered even in the dim light, silks and velvets and materials that Thomas could not even name. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, unsure of what to do. His first instinct was to close the door and report the security breach. That was what his training told him to do. But something held him in place, a curiosity that he could not explain. Thomas had always been a rule follower, a man who did exactly what was expected of him. But, in that moment, standing on the threshold of a room filled with royal secrets, he felt something shift inside him. He stepped into the room. The air smelled of old fabric and preservation chemicals, a scent that Thomas would come to associate with this moment for the rest of his life. He walked slowly between the racks, his eyes moving from one garment to the next. He recognized some of them from photographs he had seen in books and newspapers. There was a gown that Queen Victoria had worn, its fabric still holding its shape after more than a century. There was a military uniform that had belonged to King George VI, its medals still pinned to the chest. Thomas moved deeper into the room, drawn forward by a force he could not name. The clothing racks gave way to glass cases, each one containing items that were clearly even more precious. He saw crowns and tiaras, necklaces and brooches, rings and bracelets that sparkled with gems worth more than he would earn in a lifetime. But Thomas was not interested in the jewelry. His attention was focused on something else, something that he could see at the back of the room. There was a wardrobe standing against the far wall, an antique piece of furniture that looked out of place among the modern storage racks and glass cases. It was made of dark wood, carved with intricate patterns that Thomas could not quite make out in the dim light. The wardrobe had 2 doors, both of them closed, and something about it called to Thomas in a way that he could not understand. He approached the wardrobe slowly, his heart beating faster with each step. He did not know why this particular piece of furniture had captured his attention when the room was filled with treasures that most people would never see. But Thomas had learned to trust his instincts over the years, and his instincts were telling him that something important was waiting for him behind those carved wooden doors. When he reached the wardrobe, he stopped and simply looked at it for a moment. Up close, he could see that the carvings were of flowers and vines, winding their way across the surface of the wood in patterns that seemed almost alive. The handles were made of brass, tarnished with age but still solid beneath his fingers when he reached out to touch them. Thomas pulled open the doors. Inside the wardrobe, hanging from a padded hanger, was a robe that Thomas recognized immediately. He had seen it on television, had watched it being worn during one of the most significant moments in British history. It was the coronation robe of the late Queen Elizabeth II, the purple velvet garment trimmed with ermine that she had worn when she was crowned in Westminster Abbey in 1953. But something was wrong. Thomas knew that the Queen's coronation robes were supposed to be kept in a special vault, preserved for future generations and occasionally displayed at exhibitions. They were not supposed to be hanging in an unmarked wardrobe in an obscure storage room. And they were certainly not supposed to be in a room that was connected to the private quarters of Queen Camilla. Thomas stood frozen before the open wardrobe, his mind racing with questions that he could not answer. How had this robe ended up here? Who had moved it from its proper place? And why was it being kept in what appeared to be Camilla's personal storage space? He reached out and touched the velvet, feeling its softness beneath his fingertips. The fabric was cool and smooth, surprisingly well preserved for something that was more than 70 years old. Thomas had never touched anything belonging to royalty before, had never dared to cross that invisible line that separated those who served from those who ruled. But, in this moment, standing alone in a room full of secrets, he could not help himself. As his fingers moved across the fabric, Thomas noticed something else. There was a tag attached to the hanger, a small piece of paper with handwriting on it. He leaned closer to read the words, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The tag read simply, "For alterations." See? Thomas stepped back from the wardrobe, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The coronation robe of the late Queen was not supposed to be altered. It was a historical artifact, protected by law and tradition. The idea that someone would even consider changing it was almost impossible to comprehend. And yet here it was, tagged and waiting, as if it were nothing more than an ordinary garment being prepared for the dry cleaner. He closed the wardrobe doors and stood in the silence of the room, trying to decide what to do. His training told him to report what he had found immediately. But report to whom? Thomas had served in the palace long enough to know that there were some things that could not be spoken about openly. There were some secrets that were too dangerous to share. Thomas thought about his wife, Margaret, and their 2 children, Sarah and James. He thought about the small house they owned in a suburb of London, the mortgage they were still paying off, the plans they had made for retirement. If he reported what he had found and it turned out to be something innocent, he might be seen as a troublemaker. But if he reported it and it turned out to be something significant, he might be seen as a threat. He also thought about the late Queen, a woman he had admired from a distance for his entire life. She had represented everything that Thomas believed in: duty, service, dignity, and grace. The idea that her coronation robe might be treated with anything less than the utmost respect filled him with a deep and surprising anger. Thomas made his decision. He would not report what he had found. Not yet. First, he needed to understand what was happening, needed to gather more information before he took any action. He was a patient man, a careful man. He would watch and wait, and, when the time was right, he would act. He left the storage room and closed the door behind him, making sure that it was secured exactly as he had found it. Then, he continued his rounds, walking the corridors of the palace as if nothing had happened. But, inside, everything had changed. Thomas Crawford was no longer simply a guard doing his job. He was now a man with a secret, a man who had stumbled upon something that could shake the very foundations of the monarchy. The rest of that day passed in a blur. Thomas went through the motions of his duties, standing at his posts, saluting the appropriate people, keeping his expression neutral and his thoughts hidden. But his mind was constantly returning to the storage room and the wardrobe and the robe that hung inside it. He began to notice things that he had never noticed before. He paid attention to the comings and goings of the palace staff, trying to identify anyone who might have access to that particular corridor. He watched for any signs of unusual activity, any hint that someone else knew about the robe and what it might mean. Most of all, Thomas watched Queen Camilla. He had always been respectful of the queen consort, understanding that she held a difficult position. She had married into the royal family later in life, after years of controversy and public scrutiny. She had won over many of her critics through her charitable work and her devotion to the late King Charles III. But now Thomas looked at her with new eyes, wondering what secrets she might be hiding behind her carefully constructed public image. He noticed that Camilla seemed particularly busy in the weeks following his discovery. She attended more events than usual, met with more people, and spent more time in the private quarters of the palace. Thomas could not help but wonder if some of these activities were connected to the robe he had found. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after his discovery, Thomas was standing guard near the entrance to the private apartments when he overheard a conversation that made his heart stop. Two members of the household staff were talking in low voices, clearly unaware that Thomas could hear them. "Did you hear about the commission?" one of them asked. "What commission?" the other replied. "The seamstress. The one from France. They brought her in specially for some kind of project. Top secret, apparently." Thomas forced himself to remain still, to keep his expression blank, to give no indication that he was listening to every word. "What kind of project?" the second staff member asked. "Nobody knows for sure. But I heard it has something to do with the coronation." "The coronation? But that was months ago." "I know. Strange, isn't it?" The two staff members moved on, their voices fading as they walked down the corridor. Thomas was left alone with his thoughts, his suspicions growing stronger with each passing moment. A seamstress from France. A secret project. Something to do with the coronation. Thomas knew that he could not ignore what he had heard. The pieces were beginning to come together, forming a picture that he found deeply troubling. The coronation robe of the late queen, the tag requesting alterations, the mysterious seamstress working on a secret project. It all pointed to something that Thomas could barely bring himself to consider. Was Queen Camilla planning to wear the late queen's coronation robe? Was she having it altered to fit her? The very idea seemed impossible, disrespectful, almost sacrilegious. The coronation robes were sacred objects, symbols of the monarchy itself. They were not meant to be passed down and reused like ordinary clothing. But Thomas also knew that Camilla had faced criticism for years about her legitimacy as a member of the royal family. Some people still refused to accept her, still saw her as an outsider who had forced her way into a world where she did not belong. Perhaps wearing the late queen's coronation robe was a way for Camilla to claim a connection to that legacy, to establish herself as a true queen in the eyes of the world. Or perhaps Thomas was wrong. Perhaps there was an innocent explanation for everything he had seen and heard. Perhaps the robe was simply being cleaned or preserved, and the tag was a misunderstanding, and the seamstress was working on something completely unrelated. Thomas wanted to believe the innocent explanation. He wanted to believe that the royal family he had served for 15 years was exactly what it appeared to be, a group of dedicated public servants who took their responsibilities seriously and honored the traditions of their ancestors. But the evidence was pointing in a different direction, and Thomas knew that he could not ignore it forever. That night, when he returned home to Margaret and the children, Thomas was quieter than usual. Margaret noticed immediately, because she always noticed when something was bothering her husband. They had been married for 18 years, and, in that time, she had learned to read him better than anyone else in the world. "What's wrong?" she asked, as they sat together in the kitchen after the children had gone to bed. Thomas looked at his wife, at her kind face and worried eyes, and he wanted more than anything to tell her everything. But he knew that he could not, at least not yet. The secrets of the palace were not his to share, and he was not ready to involve Margaret in something that could potentially put their entire family at risk. "Just tired," he said. "Long day." Margaret did not look convinced, but she did not push. That was one of the things Thomas loved most about her. She trusted him, gave him the space he needed, and waited patiently for him to come to her when he was ready. "Well, come to bed soon," she said, standing up and kissing him on the forehead. "You need your rest." Thomas nodded and watched her go, then sat alone in the kitchen for a long time, thinking about what he had discovered and what he should do about it. He knew that he could not simply forget what he had seen. The image of that robe hanging in the wardrobe, the tag with its cryptic message, was burned into his memory now. It would haunt him until he found the answers he was looking for. In the weeks that followed, Thomas became a different kind of guard. He was no longer content to simply stand at his posts and follow his orders. He began to investigate, carefully and quietly, using the access that his position gave him to learn more about what was happening behind the closed doors of the palace. He made friends with some of the household staff, people who had been working in the palace for years and knew its secrets better than anyone. He asked casual questions, never revealing what he knew, never suggesting that he suspected anything. But, slowly, piece by piece, he began to build a picture of what was happening. He learned that the seamstress from France was indeed working on a secret project, though nobody seemed to know exactly what it was. He learned that certain items had been moved from the official royal collection to private storage rooms, though nobody could explain why. And he learned that Queen Camilla had been spending an unusual amount of time in the east wing of the palace, the same wing where Thomas had discovered the wardrobe. Each piece of information confirmed what Thomas already suspected. Something was happening, something that was being kept hidden from the public and, perhaps even from other members of the royal family. And, at the center of it all was the coronation robe of the late Queen Elizabeth II. Thomas knew that he could not investigate forever. Sooner or later, he would have to make a decision. He would have to decide whether to reveal what he knew or to keep it secret. He would have to decide whether to protect the royal family or to protect the legacy of the queen he had admired for so long. But, for now, Thomas watched and waited, gathering information, biding his time, and wondering where this path would ultimately lead him. He had stumbled upon a secret that could change everything, and he was determined to see it through to the end, no matter what the cost might be. The fog that had hung over the palace on the morning of his discovery had long since lifted. But, in its place, a different kind of darkness had settled over Thomas Crawford's life. It was the darkness of knowledge, the weight of secrets, and the burden of a decision that only he could make. As the weeks turned into months, Thomas continued his double life. By day, he was the model guard, reliable and professional, never giving anyone reason to suspect that he was anything other than what he appeared to be. But, by night, in the quiet of his home, he thought about what he had discovered and wondered what the future would bring. He did not know it yet, but his discovery was only the beginning. The secrets of the wardrobe would lead him down a path that he could never have imagined, a path that would test everything he believed in and force him to make choices that would change his life forever. The story of Thomas Crawford and the late Queen's coronation robe was just beginning, and, before it was over, it would touch the lives of people across the nation and around the world. For now, though, Thomas kept his silence and his secrets, walking the corridors of the palace with his head held high and his heart heavy with the weight of what he knew. He was a royal guard, a protector of the monarchy, and he would fulfill his duty until the very end. But he was also a man of conscience, a man who believed in truth and justice, and he would not let those beliefs be compromised, no matter what the cost. The wardrobe stood silent in the storage room, its carved doors closed, its secrets hidden from the world. But Thomas knew what lay inside, and he would not forget. The late Queen's coronation robe was waiting, and, sooner or later, the truth about why it was there would come to light. Thomas Crawford had made sure of that. The palace continued its daily routines, unaware that one of its own had discovered something that could shake its very foundations. The tourists continued to gather at the gates, the ceremonies continued to unfold with precision and grace, and the royal family continued to present a united front to the world. But, beneath the surface, invisible to all but one man, a storm was brewing. And Thomas Crawford stood at its center, waiting for the moment when he would have to decide which way the winds would blow. 3 months had passed since Thomas Crawford first opened the carved wooden doors of that wardrobe, and, in that time, he had transformed from a simple guard into something far more complicated. He had become an investigator, a keeper of secrets, and a man torn between his loyalty to the institution he served and his commitment to the truth. The investigation had consumed him in ways that he had not anticipated. Every spare moment was spent thinking about what he had discovered, analyzing the information he had gathered, and planning his next move. Margaret had noticed the change in him, had watched him grow distant and distracted, but she continued to give him the space he seemed to need. She trusted her husband, believed in him, even when she did not understand what was happening behind his increasingly troubled eyes. Thomas had learned a great deal in the 3 months since his discovery. He had identified the seamstress from France, a woman named Claudette Beaumont, who was known in exclusive circles as one of the finest experts in historical textile restoration. She had worked on garments for museums, for private collectors, and for royal families across Europe. Her involvement suggested that whatever was being done to the coronation robe was being done with the utmost care and expertise. But that knowledge did not comfort Thomas. It only confirmed his worst fears. The late Queen's coronation robe was indeed being altered, being prepared for some purpose that had not been announced to the public. And, the more Thomas learned, the more convinced he became that Queen Camilla was at the center of it all. He had tracked the movements of the seamstress, noting the times she arrived at the palace and the times she left. He had observed which staff members were involved in her work, which rooms she visited, and which members of the royal household she met with. The pattern that emerged was unmistakable. Claudette Beaumont answered to one person and one person only, Queen Camilla herself. Thomas had also discovered that the coronation robe was not the only item from the late Queen's collection that had been moved to the private storage rooms. There were other garments, other accessories, other treasures that had been quietly transferred away from the official archives and into spaces that only Camilla and her closest advisors could access. It was as if a systematic effort was underway to claim the late Queen's legacy piece by piece. The discovery had awakened something in Thomas that he had not known existed. He had always been a passive man, content to follow orders and do his duty without question. But now he found himself driven by a sense of mission, a need to understand what was happening and to ensure that the right thing was done. He began to keep a journal, writing down everything he observed and everything he learned. He was careful to hide the journal from Margaret and the children, keeping it locked in a drawer in his study that only he could access. He knew that if anyone found the journal, his career would be over. But he also knew that he needed a record of what he had discovered, something that could serve as evidence if the time came to reveal the truth. One evening in early winter, Thomas returned home from a particularly long shift to find Margaret waiting for him in the living room. She was sitting in her favorite chair by the window, the one where she liked to read in the evenings, but there was no book in her hands. Instead, she was simply sitting there, watching the door, waiting for him to come home. "We need to talk," she said, as soon as Thomas had taken off his coat. Thomas felt his heart sink. He had known this moment was coming, had known that he could not keep his secrets from Margaret forever. But he had hoped for more time, hoped that he could find the answers he was looking for before he had to involve his wife in this dangerous business. "What's wrong?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. Margaret stood up and walked toward him, stopping just a few feet away. Her eyes were filled with a mixture of concern and determination that Thomas knew well. It was the same look she had given him when they were first dating, and she had demanded to know his intentions. It was the look that said she would not be put off, would not be satisfied with half-truths or evasions. "You've been different for months," she said. "Distant. Distracted. You barely sleep anymore, and, when you do, you have nightmares that wake you up in the middle of the night. I've tried to be patient, tried to give you time to work through whatever is bothering you. But I can't watch you destroy yourself like this anymore. I need to know what's happening." Thomas looked at his wife, at the woman who had stood by him through everything, who had supported him when he decided to join the military, who had waited for him when he was deployed overseas, who had celebrated with him when he was selected for the Royal Guard. She deserved the truth. She deserved to know what was consuming him. "Sit down," Thomas said. This is going to take a while. They sat together on the sofa, and Thomas began to tell Margaret everything. He told her about the morning he had discovered the open door, about the storage room filled with treasures, about the wardrobe and the coronation robe that hung inside it. He told her about the tag requesting alterations, about the seamstress from France, about the pattern of movements he had observed over the past 3 months. Margaret listened without interrupting, her face growing more serious with each new revelation. When Thomas finally finished, she sat in silence for a long moment, processing everything she had heard. "What are you going to do?" she finally asked. "I don't know," Thomas admitted. "I've been trying to gather enough information to understand what's really happening before I make any decisions. But the more I learn, the more confused I become. Part of me thinks I should report what I've found to someone in authority. But who can I trust? The palace hierarchy is complex, and I don't know who might be involved in whatever is happening." "Have you considered going to the press?" Margaret asked. Thomas shook his head. "That would be a betrayal of everything I've sworn to protect. The royal family trusts us to keep their secrets, to protect their privacy. If I went to the press, I would be violating that trust in the most fundamental way possible. But if they're doing something wrong, doesn't the public have a right to know?" It was a question that Thomas had asked himself 1,000 times. The public did have a right to know if the royal family was behaving inappropriately. But Thomas was not sure that what he had discovered actually constituted wrongdoing. Unusual, yes. Suspicious, certainly. But criminal or unethical? He could not say for sure. "I need more information," Thomas said. "I need to understand the full picture before I can make any decisions." Margaret reached out and took his hand. "I understand. And I want you to know that whatever you decide, I'll support you. But please, be careful. If what you've told me is true, then you're dealing with some very powerful people. People who would not hesitate to destroy you if they felt threatened." Thomas squeezed his wife's hand, grateful for her support and her wisdom. He knew that she was right, knew that he was walking a dangerous path. But he also knew that he could not turn back now. He had to see this through to the end. In the days that followed, Thomas continued his investigation with renewed determination. But he was more careful now, more aware of the risks he was taking. He varied his routines, changed the times and places where he observed the movements of the palace staff, and made sure never to stay too long in any one location. He also began to reach out to some of his colleagues, men and women he had worked with for years and trusted completely. He did not reveal what he knew, did not share the details of his discovery. But he asked questions, probed for information, tried to learn what others might have observed or suspected. What he learned surprised him. He was not the only one who had noticed something strange happening in the palace. Several of his colleagues had observed unusual movements, unexpected visitors, and secretive conversations that seemed out of place. But none of them had put the pieces together the way Thomas had. None of them had discovered the wardrobe and the robe that hung inside it. One of Thomas's closest friends on the guard, a man named Robert Mitchell, pulled him aside one afternoon after a particularly tense shift. Robert was an older man, a veteran of the Falklands War who had been serving in the palace for nearly 25 years. If anyone knew the secrets of this place, it was Robert. "Something's bothering you," Robert said, in his direct way. "I've noticed it for weeks. You're not yourself anymore, Thomas. You've got something on your mind that's eating you alive." Thomas hesitated. He had been careful not to involve anyone else in his investigation, not wanting to put others at risk. But Robert was a friend, a trusted colleague, and, perhaps more importantly, a man with decades of experience navigating the complex politics of the palace. "Can I trust you?" Thomas asked. Robert looked at him for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. "You've known me for 15 years. In all that time, have I ever given you a reason to doubt me?" "No," Thomas admitted. "You haven't. Then, speak. Whatever it is, I'll listen." Thomas told Robert about his discovery, though he left out some of the details that he was not yet ready to share. He told him about the storage room, about the wardrobe, about the coronation robe. He told him about the seamstress and the alterations and his suspicions about what it all meant. When he finished, Robert was silent for a long time. His face had grown pale, and there was a look in his eyes that Thomas had never seen before. It was fear, Thomas realized. Robert Mitchell, a man who had faced death in the South Atlantic and never flinched, was afraid. "You need to be very careful," Robert finally said. "You have no idea what you've stumbled into." "What do you mean? Do you know something?" Robert glanced around, making sure that no one was within earshot. "I've heard rumors over the years. Whispers about things that happen in the private quarters, about conflicts within the family that never make it to the public. Most of it I dismissed as gossip. But what you've told me, it fits a pattern that I've been seeing for years." "What pattern?" Robert lowered his voice even further. "There are those who believe that Queen Camilla never truly accepted her role as a secondary figure in the monarchy. They say she resented being in the shadow of the late queen, even after becoming queen consort herself. They say she has been working quietly for years to establish herself as the true heir to the throne's legacy, to claim for herself the respect and admiration that was always reserved for Elizabeth." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. This was exactly what he had suspected, but hearing it confirmed by someone with Robert's experience made it seem suddenly more real and more dangerous. "But the coronation robe," Thomas said. "Surely she couldn't actually wear it. The public would never accept it." "You might be surprised what the public will accept if it's presented to them in the right way. And, remember, Camilla has spent years rehabilitating her image. She's gone from being the most hated woman in Britain to someone who is generally respected, if not loved. If she were to claim the late Queen's legacy for herself, there would certainly be criticism. But there would also be those who supported her, who saw it as a natural continuation of the royal tradition." Thomas shook his head. "I can't accept that. The late Queen was beloved. Her memory is sacred to millions of people. To take her coronation robe and wear it as if it were just another piece of clothing, it would be a betrayal of everything she stood for." Robert placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "I understand how you feel. But you need to understand something. In the world of the royals, tradition is whatever they say it is. They have been making and breaking rules for 1,000 years. What seems sacred to us may seem merely convenient to them. So what should I do?" Robert was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing his words carefully. "If I were you, I would do nothing. I would forget what I saw, continue my duties, and pretend that none of this ever happened. The risks of getting involved are too great, and the likelihood of changing anything is too small." "I'm not sure I can do that," Thomas said. "I know," Robert replied. "I could see it in your eyes the moment you started telling me your story. You're not the kind of man who can look the other way when he sees something wrong. It's one of your best qualities, and one of your most dangerous." Robert turned to go, then stopped and looked back at Thomas. "Just promise me you'll be careful. Whatever you decide to do, don't do it rashly. Think through every step, every possibility. And remember that the palace has survived for centuries by protecting its secrets. They will not hesitate to destroy anyone who threatens that protection." With that warning, Robert walked away, leaving Thomas alone with his thoughts. The conversation had confirmed his worst fears, but it had also given him something he had been lacking: confirmation that he was not imagining things. The threat was real, the stakes were high, and the decision he faced was one that could change his life forever. That night, Thomas sat alone in his study, the journal open before him. He had written down everything Robert had told him, adding it to the growing record of his investigation. The pages were filling up quickly now, a testament to how deep this rabbit hole went. He thought about what Robert had said, about the advice to do nothing, to look the other way and pretend that nothing was happening. It was sensible advice, practical advice, the kind of advice that a reasonable person would follow. But Thomas had never been particularly reasonable when it came to matters of principle. He thought about the late Queen, about everything she had represented. Elizabeth II had been more than just a monarch. She had been a symbol of stability, of duty, of service to something greater than oneself. She had guided the nation through decades of change and challenge, always maintaining her dignity and her commitment to the crown. The idea that her memory could be appropriated, that her most sacred possessions could be claimed by someone who had spent years as an outsider to the family, filled Thomas with an anger that he could barely contain. It was wrong. It was simply and fundamentally wrong. But what could he do about it? He was just a guard, a man of no particular importance in the grand hierarchy of the palace. He had no power, no influence, no way to change the course of events that seemed to be unfolding around him. Or did he? Thomas thought about the journal sitting before him, about the record he had been compiling for months. It was evidence, perhaps not conclusive evidence, but enough to raise questions. Enough to start a conversation that the palace would not want to have. But who could he share it with? Who could he trust to take his concerns seriously without dismissing him as a crank or, worse, as a traitor? The answer came to him slowly, emerging from the depths of his memory like a ship materializing out of fog. There was someone he could contact, someone who had dedicated her life to protecting the legacy of the late queen. Someone who might be willing to listen to what he had discovered. Her name was Lady Catherine Ashworth, and she had served as one of the late queen's ladies-in-waiting for more than 30 years. Thomas had met her several times during his years at the palace, always in passing, always briefly. But he remembered her as a woman of fierce loyalty and uncompromising integrity. If anyone would understand the significance of what Thomas had discovered, it would be Lady Catherine. The decision to reach out to her was not made lightly. Thomas knew that once he took this step, there would be no going back. He would be committing himself to a course of action that could end his career, damage his family, and potentially put him in danger. But he also knew that he could not live with himself if he did nothing. He spent the next several days planning his approach. He could not simply call Lady Catherine or send her a letter. Such communications might be intercepted, might raise suspicions. He needed to find a way to speak with her privately, away from the watchful eyes of the palace staff. The opportunity came sooner than he expected. Thomas learned that Lady Catherine would be attending a charity event in London, a fundraiser for a children's hospital that the late Queen had supported for many years. The event was open to the public, though tickets were expensive. Thomas used some of his savings to purchase a ticket, telling Margaret that he had been invited by a colleague. The night of the event, Thomas put on his best suit and took the train into central London. The venue was a grand ballroom in one of the city's oldest hotels, decorated with flowers and candles and filled with people in evening dress. Thomas felt out of place among the wealthy donors and titled aristocrats, but he forced himself to remain calm, to move through the crowd as if he belonged there. He spotted Lady Catherine almost immediately. She was standing near the entrance to the ballroom, greeting guests as they arrived. Even at her age, she was an imposing figure, tall and elegant, with silver hair swept back from her face and a bearing that spoke of decades spent in the presence of royalty. Thomas approached her slowly, waiting for a moment when she was not surrounded by other guests. When the opportunity came, he stepped forward and introduced himself. "Lady Catherine, my name is Thomas Crawford. I serve as a guard at the palace, and I was wondering if I might have a word with you in private." Lady Catherine looked at him with sharp, assessing eyes. "A guard? How unusual. What could you possibly want to discuss with me?" "It concerns the late Queen," Thomas said, lowering his voice. "And something that I believe would have upset her greatly." The mention of the late Queen seemed to catch Lady Catherine's attention. Her expression changed, becoming more serious, more focused. "Very well. Follow me." She led him to a small anteroom off the main ballroom, closing the door behind them to ensure their privacy. Then, she turned to face him, her arms crossed, her expression expectant. "You have 5 minutes," she said. "Make them count." Thomas took a deep breath and began to speak. He told Lady Catherine everything: the discovery, the wardrobe, the coronation robe, the seamstress, the alterations. He spoke quickly but clearly, making sure she understood the significance of what he was saying. When he finished, Lady Catherine was silent for a long moment. Her face had grown pale, and there was a look in her eyes that Thomas could not quite identify. Was it anger? Sadness? Determination? "How do I know you're telling the truth?" she finally asked. "I have documentation," Thomas said. "A journal with dates, times, observations. I've been keeping records for months." "And you came to me because?" "Because I know how much you loved the late Queen. Because I know you would never allow her memory to be dishonored. Because I had no one else to turn to." Lady Catherine studied him for a long moment, as if trying to read his very soul. Then, slowly, she nodded. "I believe you," she said. "God help us both, but I believe you." She reached into her handbag and pulled out a small card, pressing it into Thomas's hand. "This is my private number. Call me tomorrow, and we will discuss what to do next. But be careful, Mr. Crawford. Be very careful. You have uncovered something that powerful people would rather keep hidden. And powerful people can be very dangerous when they feel threatened." With that, Lady Catherine left the anteroom and returned to the charity event, leaving Thomas alone with his thoughts and the card in his hand. He had taken the first step, had found an ally in his quest to uncover the truth. But he knew that this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long and difficult, filled with dangers that he could barely imagine. And, at the end of that road, waiting in the shadows, was a confrontation that would change everything. Thomas put the card in his pocket and made his way out of the hotel, disappearing into the London night. Behind him, the charity event continued, the wealthy guests laughing and chatting, completely unaware of the drama that had just unfolded in their midst. The secret of the wardrobe was no longer Thomas's alone. And soon, very soon, it would be a secret no more. The next morning, Thomas woke early, before the sun had risen, and lay in bed thinking about everything that had happened. Margaret was still asleep beside him, her breathing slow and peaceful, and, for a moment he envied her. She did not carry the weight that he carried, did not know the full extent of what he had uncovered. But he knew that could not last. Soon, Margaret would need to know everything. Soon, all of them would need to know. Thomas got out of bed quietly, careful not to wake his wife, and went downstairs to the kitchen. He made himself a cup of tea and sat at the table, looking out the window at the slowly brightening sky. In a few hours, he would call Lady Catherine. And then, whatever happened next, his life would never be the same. He thought about his children, Sarah and James, still sleeping in their rooms upstairs. They were teenagers now, almost adults, with their own lives and their own concerns. They knew their father worked at the palace, but they had never shown much interest in the details of his job. To them, he was just Dad, the man who made them breakfast on weekends and helped them with their homework and embarrassed them in front of their friends. What would they think of him when all of this came out? Would they be proud of him for standing up for what he believed in? Or would they be angry at him for putting the family at risk? Thomas did not know the answers to these questions. All he knew was that he had to do what was right, regardless of the consequences. That was the lesson his mother had taught him, all those years ago in their little house in Yorkshire. Do the right thing, she had always said, and everything else will follow. He hoped she was right. He hoped that the path he had chosen would lead somewhere good, somewhere meaningful, somewhere that would justify all the risks he was taking. But, deep down, in a part of his soul that he rarely acknowledged, Thomas was afraid. He was afraid of what he might discover, afraid of what he might lose, afraid of the powerful forces that he was preparing to challenge. The tea grew cold in his hands as he sat there, watching the sun rise over London, waiting for the moment when everything would change. Thomas Crawford, Royal Guard and Keeper of Secrets, was about to become something else entirely. He was about to become a man who would shake the very foundations of the monarchy, who would force the nation to confront uncomfortable truths about the people they had placed on the throne. And he had no idea if he was ready for what that would mean. Lady Catherine Ashworth sat in the drawing room of her townhouse in Kensington, a cup of untouched tea cooling on the table beside her. It was the morning after the charity event, and she had not slept. The words of the palace guard, Thomas Crawford, kept echoing in her mind, mixing with memories of the late Queen that she had tried so hard to preserve. She had served Elizabeth II for more than 3 decades, had been by her side through triumphs and tragedies, through celebrations and crises. She had seen the Queen at her strongest and at her most vulnerable. She had held her hand when Prince Philip died, had watched her struggle to maintain her composure in the face of unbearable grief. And she had been there at the very end, in those final days at Balmoral, when the woman she had loved and served finally let go of the burden she had carried for 70 years. The coronation robe was more than just a piece of clothing to Lady Catherine. It was a symbol of everything the late Queen had stood for, a physical embodiment of the duty and service that had defined her reign. The idea that someone might take that robe, might alter it for their own use, filled Lady Catherine with a rage that she could barely contain. She knew Queen Camilla, of course. They had met many times over the years, first when Camilla was the mistress that everyone pretended not to know about, then, when she was the wife that everyone pretended to accept. Lady Catherine had always been polite to her, had always maintained the proper courtesies, but she had never truly warmed to her. There was something about Camilla that Lady Catherine could not trust, a calculation behind her eyes that seemed at odds with the warmth she projected to the public. Now, if what Thomas Crawford had told her was true, that calculation had taken a darker turn. Camilla was not content to be queen consort, not satisfied with the title and the position that had come to her through marriage. She wanted more. She wanted to claim the legacy of Elizabeth II as her own. Lady Catherine picked up her phone and dialed the number that Thomas had given her the night before. He answered on the second ring, his voice tense with anticipation. "Lady Catherine?" "Yes, Mr. Crawford. I've been thinking about what you told me, and I believe we need to meet. Somewhere private, somewhere we won't be observed." "I agree. Where would you suggest?" Lady Catherine thought for a moment. "There's a church in Chelsea, St. Luke's. It's quiet during the week, and the vicar is an old friend. He'll give us privacy." "Can you be there at 2 o'clock this afternoon?" "I'll be there." Lady Catherine ended the call and sat back in her chair, her mind already racing with plans and possibilities. She knew that she was entering dangerous territory, that the forces arrayed against her were powerful and ruthless. But she also knew that she could not stand by and watch the late Queen's memory be dishonored. She had made a promise to Elizabeth II, a promise that she would always protect her legacy, always guard her memory against those who would seek to exploit or diminish it. It was a promise she intended to keep, no matter what the cost. Thomas arrived at St. Luke's Church 15 minutes early, wanting to make sure that the location was safe before Lady Catherine arrived. The church was exactly as she had described it, quiet, peaceful, and empty except for an elderly woman arranging flowers near the altar. He found a seat in one of the back pews and waited, trying to calm the nervous energy that had been building inside him since the night before. This meeting would determine the course of everything that followed. Lady Catherine was his only ally, his only connection to the world of power and influence that controlled the palace. If she decided not to help him, he would be alone again, facing an impossible task with no resources and no support. Lady Catherine arrived exactly at 2 o'clock, dressed simply in a dark coat and carrying a leather bag that seemed to contain several folders. She spotted Thomas immediately and walked toward him, her stride purposeful and confident despite her age. "Mr. Crawford," she said, sliding into the pew beside him. "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," Thomas replied. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," Lady Catherine admitted. "When I woke up this morning, I told myself that what you told me couldn't possibly be true. That you were mistaken, or lying, or perhaps even delusional. But then, I started thinking about some of the things I've observed over the past few years, things that I dismissed at the time but now seem more significant." "What kind of things?" Lady Catherine opened her bag and pulled out one of the folders, laying it on the pew between them. "I've kept files on the royal family for years. Notes, newspaper clippings, photographs, correspondence. Call it professional habit, or perhaps just the caution of someone who has spent her life navigating the treacherous waters of the palace." She opened the folder to reveal a collection of photographs. Thomas recognized some of them as official royal portraits, but others were candid shots, taken at events and gatherings that the public never saw. Look at this one, Lady Catherine said, pointing to a photograph near the top of the pile. This was taken at the late Queen's funeral. Do you see what Camilla is wearing? Thomas looked closely at the photograph. It showed Queen Camilla standing beside the king, both of them dressed in mourning black. Camilla's outfit was elegant and appropriate, nothing that seemed out of place for such a solemn occasion. But then, Thomas noticed something that made him pause. The brooch, he said. She's wearing a brooch. Not just any brooch, Lady Catherine replied. That's the Dorset rose brooch. It belonged to the late Queen, and she wore it only on the most special occasions. It was one of her favorites, a gift from her mother when she was just a girl. How did Camilla get it? That's exactly the question, isn't it? The official story is that the late Queen left it to her in her will. But I have my doubts. I was with Her Majesty when she made her final arrangements, and she never mentioned leaving anything to Camilla. In fact, she was quite careful to ensure that certain items went to specific people. Thomas felt his pulse quicken. This was exactly the kind of evidence he needed, the kind of pattern that would support his concerns about the coronation robe. Are there other examples? He asked. Lady Catherine nodded and flipped through the folder, pointing to various photographs and documents. The diamond tiara she wore to last year's state dinner. The pearl necklace at the Christmas broadcast. The sapphire ring at the garden party. All of these belong to the late Queen, and all of them have somehow ended up in Camilla's possession. Could they have been gifts? Or loans from the official collection? Some of them, perhaps. But not all. The Dorset rose brooch, for example, was never part of the official collection. It was the late Queen's personal property, kept in her private quarters at Balmoral. How did it end up on Camilla's lapel less than 6 months after the funeral? Thomas sat back, processing this new information. The picture that was emerging was even more disturbing than he had imagined. It was not just the coronation robe. It was a systematic effort to claim the late Queen's legacy, piece by piece, item by item. Why? He asked. Why would she do this? Lady Catherine sighed. Power. Legitimacy. The desire to be seen as a true queen, not just a consort who was lucky enough to marry into the family. Camilla has spent decades being vilified by the public, blamed for breaking up the marriage of the most beloved princess in the world. Even after years of rehabilitation, even after the late Queen publicly accepted her, there are still millions of people who refuse to see her as anything other than the woman who destroyed Diana's happiness. So she's trying to replace that image with a new one, Thomas said, understanding dawning. She's trying to make herself into the new Elizabeth, to claim all the respect and admiration that came with the late Queen's position. Exactly. And what better way to do that than to literally wear the late Queen's clothes? To surround herself with the artifacts of Elizabeth's reign and present herself as the rightful heir to that legacy? Thomas thought about this for a long moment. It made a terrible kind of sense. Camilla had always been an outsider, always on the edges of the royal family looking in. Now she had the opportunity to rewrite history, to transform herself from villain to hero in the public imagination. But there was still the question of what they could do about it. Lady Catherine might have files and photographs, but that was not enough to challenge the palace. They needed more. They needed proof that could not be denied or explained away. The coronation robe, Thomas said. That's the key. If we can prove that Camilla is having it altered for her own use, that's something that the public will not accept. It's too significant, too symbolic. Even her supporters would have to acknowledge that it's a step too far. Lady Catherine nodded. I agree. But how do we prove it? The seamstress is working in secret, the robe is being kept in a private storage room, and the palace will deny everything if we make accusations without evidence. Thomas had been thinking about this problem for weeks. He had considered various options, each with its own risks and limitations. But now, sitting in this quiet church with his unlikely ally, he finally knew what he had to do. I need to go back to the storage room, he said. I need to document what's there, photograph the robe, and find evidence of the alterations that are being made. That's incredibly dangerous, Lady Catherine said. If you're caught, you'll lose everything. I know. But I don't see another way. We need proof, real proof, and the only place to get it is inside that room. Lady Catherine studied him for a long moment, her sharp eyes assessing his determination. Then, slowly, she nodded. Very well. But you won't do it alone. I have contacts inside the palace, people who were loyal to the late queen and who might be willing to help. Let me make some inquiries, see what kind of support I can arrange. Thank you, Thomas said, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time since he had discovered the wardrobe, he felt like he was not alone in this fight. Don't thank me yet, Lady Catherine replied. This is just the beginning. The road ahead will be long and difficult, and there's no guarantee that we'll succeed. But I made a promise to the late queen, and I intend to keep it. She stood up, gathering her folder and her bag. I'll be in touch within the week. In the meantime, be careful. Don't do anything to arouse suspicion. And, above all, don't speak to anyone else about what you know. Thomas nodded and watched her go, disappearing through the church doors into the gray afternoon light. Then, he sat alone in the silence of the church, thinking about what they had discussed and what lay ahead. He had an ally now, a powerful one. But he also had a clearer understanding of what they were up against. This was not just about a single robe or a single act of disrespect. This was about the very nature of the monarchy, about who had the right to claim its legacy and who had the power to shape its future. Thomas Crawford, the simple guard from Yorkshire, had become part of something much larger than himself. And he was determined to see it through to the end. The week that followed was one of the most difficult of Thomas's life. He went about his duties at the palace, maintaining the same routines he had followed for years, while inside he was counting down the hours until he would hear from Lady Catherine. He tried to behave normally, to give no indication that anything had changed. But it was hard. Every time he walked past the corridor that led to the storage room, he felt a pull, a desire to go back and see what had changed since his last visit. He resisted the urge, knowing that any deviation from his normal patterns might attract attention. Margaret could tell that something was happening, even though Thomas had not told her the details of his meeting with Lady Catherine. She watched him with worried eyes, asked him gentle questions about his work and his health, and made sure that he ate properly and got enough sleep. Thomas was grateful for her care, even as he felt guilty for not being able to share everything with her. One evening, about 5 days after his meeting with Lady Catherine, Thomas came home to find Margaret sitting at the kitchen table with a serious expression on her face. His heart sank immediately. He knew that look. It was the look she wore when she had something important to say, something that she had been thinking about for a long time. "We need to talk," she said, as Thomas sat down across from her. "About what?" "About whatever it is you're involved in. Don't try to deny it, Thomas. I know you too well. You've been different for months, but lately it's gotten worse. You're jumpy, distracted, constantly checking your phone. And you've been lying to me about where you go and who you meet with." Thomas wanted to protest, but he knew that Margaret was right. He had been lying to her, trying to protect her from the danger that he was walking into. But perhaps that had been a mistake. Perhaps she deserved to know the truth. "I met with someone," Thomas admitted. "Someone who can help me with what I've discovered." "Who?" "Lady Catherine Ashworth. She was one of the late Queen's ladies-in-waiting. She believes me, Margaret. She's seen the same patterns I have, and she wants to help me expose what's happening." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. When she spoke again, her voice was steady but concerned. "So it's really happening. This isn't something you can walk away from anymore." "No," Thomas said. "It's not. And you're going to see it through, no matter what." "Yes. I have to, Margaret. What they're doing, what Camilla is doing, it's wrong. Someone has to stand up and say so." Margaret reached across the table and took his hands in hers. "I know. I've known since the night you first told me about the wardrobe. I could see it in your eyes, the determination, the conviction. You're not the kind of man who can look the other way when something is wrong. Are you angry with me? Margaret shook her head. No, I'm not angry. I'm scared, Thomas. I'm scared for you, for us, for the children. But, I'm also proud of you. It takes courage to do what you're doing, to stand up against people who are so much more powerful than you are. I might lose my job, Thomas said. If this goes wrong, I might lose everything. I know. But, we'll get through it, whatever happens. We've gotten through everything else, haven't we? The deployments, the long hours, the uncertainty. This is just another challenge, and we'll face it the way we faced all the others. Together. Thomas felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. He had been carrying this burden alone for so long, afraid to share it, afraid to burden Margaret with his fears and doubts. But, now, sitting across from her in the kitchen where they had shared so many meals and conversations, he realized that he should have trusted her from the beginning. I love you, he said. I love you too. Now tell me everything. I want to know what we're up against. Thomas spent the next hour telling Margaret the complete story, from his discovery of the wardrobe to his meeting with Lady Catherine. He held nothing back, sharing every detail, every suspicion, every fear. Margaret listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious with each revelation. When he finished, she sat in silence for a long moment, clearly processing everything she had heard. Then, she stood up, walked around the table, and wrapped her arms around him. We'll get through this, she whispered. Together. They held each other for a long time, drawing strength from the connection they had built over 18 years of marriage. Whatever happened next, they would face it as a team. The call from Lady Catherine came 2 days later, while Thomas was on his afternoon break. He stepped outside to answer, moving to a quiet corner of the palace grounds where he could speak without being overheard. I've made contact with some people who can help us, Lady Catherine said, without preamble. There are more of us than I realized, people who served the late Queen and who are disturbed by what they've seen happening since her death. How many people are we talking about? A small group, but influential. Some still work in the palace, others have retired but maintain connections. They've agreed to help us gather evidence and, when the time is right, to stand with us when we reveal what we know. Thomas felt a surge of hope. This was better than he had expected. A network of allies, people with access and influence, working together toward a common goal. What's the next step? He asked. We need to get into that storage room and document everything. I've arranged for a diversion, something that will draw attention away from that part of the palace for long enough for you to get in and out. It will happen 3 days from now, on Thursday night. What kind of diversion? Better if you don't know the details. Just be ready. When you get the signal, you'll have approximately 30 minutes to get into the room, photograph everything relevant, and get out. Can you do that? Thomas thought about the layout of the palace, the distance from his usual post to the storage room, the security measures that he would need to bypass. 30 minutes was tight, but it was possible. Yes, he said. I can do it. Good. I'll send you more details tomorrow. And, Thomas, be careful. If you're caught, there's nothing I can do to help you. I understand. The call ended, and Thomas stood alone in the corner of the palace grounds, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. In 3 days, he would take the biggest risk of his life. He would either get the evidence they needed or lose everything in the attempt. But there was no turning back now. The wheels had been set in motion, and Thomas Crawford was committed to seeing this through to the end. He returned to his post, his face calm and composed, giving no indication of the turmoil that was churning inside him. He was a royal guard, trained to maintain his composure under any circumstances. And he would need every bit of that training in the days to come. The next 3 days passed in a blur of anticipation and anxiety. Thomas went through the motions of his daily life, caring for his family, performing his duties, pretending that everything was normal. But, inside, he was counting down the hours until Thursday night, when everything would change. He told Margaret about the plan, and, together they prepared for every possible outcome. They reviewed their finances, made arrangements for the children in case something went wrong, and said all the things that married couples say to each other when they know that danger is approaching. On Wednesday night, Thomas lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, running through the plan in his mind. He knew the layout of the storage room, knew where the wardrobe was located, knew what he needed to photograph. He had borrowed a small camera from a friend, one that was easy to conceal and operated silently. He was as prepared as he could possibly be. And, yet, as the hours ticked by toward Thursday, Thomas could not shake the feeling that everything was about to change in ways that he could not predict. The secret of the wardrobe was about to be revealed, and, when it was, nothing in his life would ever be the same again. He turned to look at Margaret, sleeping peacefully beside him, and felt a wave of love and gratitude wash over him. Whatever happened, he was grateful for her. Grateful for the life they had built together, for the family they had raised, for the support she had given him throughout this entire ordeal. Tomorrow, he would take the biggest risk of his life. But tonight, he could rest in the knowledge that he was not alone, that he was loved, and that whatever he was doing it for the right reasons. Thomas closed his eyes and waited for sleep to come, knowing that when he opened them again, the day of reckoning would finally be at hand. Thursday arrived with a heaviness that Thomas felt in his bones. The sky over London was grey and overcast, as if the weather itself knew that something momentous was about to happen. He woke before dawn, unable to sleep any longer, and sat in the kitchen drinking tea while the rest of the house remained silent. Margaret came down an hour later, her face showing the strain of the past few days. She sat beside him without speaking, and, together they watched the lights slowly strengthen outside the window. There was nothing left to say, nothing that had not already been said. They simply sat together, drawing comfort from each other's presence. When it was time for Thomas to leave for work, Margaret walked him to the door and held him tightly. "Come back to me," she whispered. "Whatever happens, come back to me." Thomas kissed her forehead and promised that he would. Then, he stepped out into the grey morning and began the journey that he hoped would bring him the evidence he needed. The palace was busy when Thomas arrived, busier than usual. There was some kind of event scheduled for the evening, a reception for foreign dignitaries, and the staff were rushing about making final preparations. Thomas noted the increased activity with interest. This was likely the diversion that Lady Catherine had arranged, the distraction that would draw attention away from the East Wing long enough for him to complete his mission. He went through his morning duties automatically, his mind focused on what would happen that night. He ate lunch without tasting it, spoke to colleagues without hearing them, and counted down the minutes until the moment when he would receive the signal to act. The signal came at 7:30 in the evening, exactly when Lady Catherine had said it would. Thomas was at his post near the main entrance when his phone buzzed with a single text message, "Now." He took a deep breath, steadied his nerves, and began to move. He had rehearsed this route in his mind 100 times, knew exactly where he needed to go and how long it would take him to get there. He walked with purpose but without haste, not wanting to attract attention from the other guards who were focused on the reception taking place in the grand ballroom. The corridor leading to the storage room was deserted, just as Lady Catherine had promised. Thomas moved quickly now, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet. He reached the door in less than 5 minutes and found it unlocked, as if someone had prepared it for his arrival. He slipped inside and closed the door behind him, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. The room was dark, but Thomas had brought a small flashlight that he clicked on now, sweeping its beam across the familiar landscape of clothing racks and glass cases. The wardrobe stood at the back of the room, just as he remembered it. Thomas moved toward it quickly, aware that every second counted. He had approximately 25 minutes left before the diversion ended and normal security routines resumed. He opened the wardrobe doors and there it was, the coronation robe of the late Queen Elizabeth II, hanging from its padded hanger just as he had seen it months ago. But something was different. The robe had been changed. Thomas pulled out his camera and began taking photographs, documenting everything he could see. The alterations were visible even in the dim light of his flashlight. The hem had been shortened, the shoulders had been taken in, and new panels of fabric had been added to the sides to adjust the fit. Someone had been working on this robe, reshaping it to fit a different body. But it was what he saw next that truly stopped his heart. Hanging beside the coronation robe was another garment, one that Thomas had not seen during his first visit to this room. It was a gown, a magnificent creation of silk and lace that seemed to glow in the darkness. And, pinned to its bodice was a note in elegant handwriting that Thomas recognized immediately. The note read, "For the memorial service. See." Thomas photographed the note and the gown, his hands trembling slightly as he worked. The memorial service. There was only one memorial service that mattered in the royal calendar, the annual remembrance of the late Queen Elizabeth II, held every year on the anniversary of her death. Camilla was planning to wear this gown, possibly altered from one of the late Queen's own garments, to the service that honored Elizabeth's memory. It was an act of such breathtaking audacity that Thomas could barely comprehend it. He continued photographing, moving through the room systematically, documenting every item that seemed relevant. He found more clothing that had clearly been altered, more notes with Camilla's initial, more evidence of the systematic appropriation of the late Queen's wardrobe. In one corner of the room, he discovered a stack of boxes labeled with dates and descriptions. He opened several of them and found jewelry, accessories, and other personal items that had belonged to the late Queen. Each box was marked with its contents and a notation about where the item was to be delivered. Thomas photographed everything, filling the camera's memory card with evidence of what he had found. He was so absorbed in his documentation that he almost did not hear the sound of footsteps approaching in the corridor outside. He froze, his blood turning to ice. The footsteps were getting closer, accompanied by voices that he could not quite make out. Someone was coming, and if they found him here, everything would be lost. Thomas clicked off his flashlight and pressed himself into the shadows behind a rack of clothing, his heart pounding so hard he was sure it could be heard throughout the room. The footsteps stopped outside the door, and he heard a hand on the handle. The door opened, and light flooded into the room. Thomas pressed himself further into the shadows, hardly daring to breathe. "I thought I saw something," a voice said. It was a woman's voice, cultured and refined, with an undertone of suspicion that made Thomas's skin crawl. "You're imagining things," another voice replied. This one was male, calm and reassuring. "The room is locked, and no one has access without authorization." "Check it anyway. I want to be sure." Thomas heard footsteps entering the room, moving between the racks of clothing. He pressed himself as far back as he could go, praying that the darkness would conceal him. A flashlight beam swept across the room, passing just inches from where Thomas was hiding. He held his breath, every muscle in his body tense with fear. "Nothing here," the male voice said. "Just as I said." "Very well. But increase security on this corridor. I don't want any unexpected visitors." "Of course, ma'am." The footsteps retreated, and the door closed again, plunging the room back into darkness. Thomas waited for what felt like an eternity, listening for any sign that someone was still there. When he was finally convinced that he was alone, he let out a long, shaky breath. That had been close. Too close. He needed to get out of here, and he needed to do it now. Thomas checked his camera one last time, making sure that all the photographs were saved. Then, he crept to the door and pressed his ear against it, listening for any sounds in the corridor. When he heard nothing, he opened the door a crack and peered out. The corridor was empty. Thomas slipped out of the room and closed the door behind him, then began to walk quickly back toward the main part of the palace. His legs felt weak, his hands were trembling, but he forced himself to maintain a calm, professional demeanor. He had done it. He had gotten the evidence they needed. Now he just needed to get out of the palace.